Rumor has it that every bet that happens in New York State, somehow it touches Jeff's infrastructure, which is an incredible thing. And we want to ask him about that, and we're going to get into that. He owns horse tracks, he owns casinos, on and on. Anyways, let's get started. Jeff, thank you for being here.
Well, thank you. By the way, my grandson and my granddaughter went to college at Charleston, and Kiowa Island, when I visited them, Charleston's a great place to visit, and my wife and I would then go to Kiowa Island for a few days, so it's a beautiful place.
Well, Jeff's coming. So that was Jeff's confirmation that he's coming. So you guys should come too. It is a beautiful place. Jeff, you started, like I said, your family has been a part of the fabric of New York City real estate for a long time. Your father, who is like also an icon, Aaron Gural, who is very involved in civic duties, in the city's development and the city's change and transformation. But when you started, somehow you didn't have the same trajectory. You started working for the California Highway Department. And why did you choose not to go into the family business and go all the way across the country and work for the Highway Department?
Simple. I had no interest in the family business. I had no interest in real estate. I wasn't one of those people, where their father drove around and showed them buildings on the weekends. My father was playing golf on the weekends, and I loved construction. I used to watch when someone was building a house in the neighborhood. I would sit on the curb and watch it. And I went to an engineering school, RPI Rensselaer, and at that time they had no courses in construction. So when I graduated, there was only one company that was recruiting, which was Turner Construction, and my grades were terrible, so I had no shot there. And I got some leads from friends of mine, and I went to a couple of companies. One was Diesel Construction, and they were actually building a building for a cousin of mine. And the guy who I interviewed with said, "Do you have any experience?" I said, "No." He said, "Well, come back when you have experience." And now I'm stuck because what am I going to tell people who ask me, "Do you have a job?" I don't have a job. So I said, "No, I'm going to California," which was a good way of eliminating the fact that I didn't have a job. And a friend of mine was going to Stanford, and I asked him if he would keep me company and drive across country, and we'll stop at all the sightseeing place. So we drove across country. Right before we left, there was a World's Fair then, and the last thing we did, if you're a sports fan, was go to see the Mets play, and Jim Bunning pitched the first perfect game in the history of the National League. So I was a witness to that. And the next day off we went, and when we got to California, to LA, I picked up the paper, and there was pages and pages of ads for civil engineers. And the biggest ad was from the state of California Highway Department. So I went for an interview. Fortunately, he didn't ask my grades. And he told me, this is 1964, he said, "We consider an education from an Eastern school far superior to an education from a school here in California." Obviously, that's changed, I would assume. And this was also, the Vietnam War was a problem for people like who were graduating. This job was actually draft deferred, but I didn't really need that. So when I got a job, I called my girlfriend, and I said, "I got a job, let me know if you want to get married." And she flew out with her mother, who was not happy about it, and said to my face, "My daughter could have married a prince." And I said to myself, I got to get her to the airport as quickly as I can. And we got married with a justice of the peace, which was, and we've been married for 61 years, so that's worked out.
That's
And
amazing.
simple. All you have to do is know two words, "Yes, dear," and you'll stay married.
And make a lot of money in the
Yeah.
process, right?
And she still reminds me that she could have married a prince, but too bad.
And then at some point, after that, you went and started working in construction with Douglas
So-
Durst, of all people.
No, I came back. I got a great job with the state. It was a 2-year training program. So every 6 months, I switched jobs. and I got like this orange highway department truck, and back then they were starting the process of building all these freeways. All these freeways that you see didn't exist. California wasn't that populated, and the reason it was a draft deferred job was it connected all of the military bases. And what they did was, nobody wants a freeway, right, in their neighborhood, so they would create 5 different possible routes for a freeway. 4 of them would be the most objectionable route possible, and the 5th one would be less objectionable. And they would go to a public hearing and they would say, oh gee, the Brown route seems to get the most support because the other 4 would be terrible. And one of my jobs when I rotated would be to work in route planning, and sometimes they would say, come up with a good plan, and sometimes they would say, find a bad plan. And another job I had was surveying, and we would go to Beverly Hills, and I had my orange highway department truck, and we would pull up in front of someone's house and say, can we go in your backyard? And they would say, what are you doing here? And I'd say, I don't know, I think they're planning to put a freeway here.
And you were saying that as a joke, or like?
No, well, we knew they weren't, but the reason we were there was because they were planning, it would be orange, it would be one of the objectionable routes. And I loved the job, and at the end of the 2 years, I hated living in LA because LA at the time, there were very few people who were native from Los Angeles. Everybody who was there was probably there because they either didn't have a good job, didn't get along with their family, and just wanted to leave town and start over. So you met a lot of strange people, and I couldn't wait to get home. We had a child out there, and my parents wanted me to come home, and I went right back to the guy who had turned me down for a job. And I said, I followed your lead. And he hired me. It was a big company, Diesel Construction, which became Morse Diesel. But at the time, Diesel was the biggest contractor in the city. They were building almost all of the office buildings for the Jewish builders. And all of these buildings almost were built on spec. So it was a very different business. And the first job I had was in Staten Island. And my wife was from Staten Island, and I decided, okay, I'll live in Staten Island for a year while I'm finishing this project, and then we'll move someplace besides Staten Island, because I had no interest in living in Staten Island. But it turned out to be a good deal. We met a lot of people, a lot of friends, and I stayed in Staten Island I raised my family in Staten Island, which was good because it was really a blue-collar, diverse neighborhood. I grew up in a Jewish in the 5 towns. I didn't even know I was a minority until I went to college. And I saw that I had all the wrong clothes, and I told my parents, all the clothes you bought me are wrong for this.
And Jeff, at what point did your father convince you to come back to the family business? And what did he tell you that convinced you?
Very simple. So my father would take me to lunch, and he had 2 partners, and they would try to convince me to come into the business. And one of his partners, older partner, had a daughter who married a doctor, lived in Virginia, so she wasn't coming. I had 2 much younger sisters, and his third partner had very young children. So the only person that could possibly come into the business was me, and I kept saying, I'm not interested. And I worked for a horrible person named Carl Morse, who ran Diesel, and it was a great experience, because working for somebody who's horrible is really good, because you learn that nobody wants to know why something wasn't done. And no boss wants to know that the truck broke down on the way, they don't want to know that. And if you told him why it wasn't done, he would rip you apart. And I mean rip you apart. I would sometimes come in on a Saturday to the job. I moved from Staten Island to build a building, 437 Madison, for the Kaufman organization, which is now Sage Realty. And sometimes I would stupidly go in on a Saturday to catch up, and I loved that job. And he would show up, and he would say, let's go to the top of the building and walk down, and he would rip you apart on every floor. And I'm saying, I'm not getting paid. I wasn't an hourly worker. But it was a great experience, because I really learned how, you got to get things done. And the only reason that people tolerated his abuse was he told everyone that he was going to give them stock in the company and sell and make them rich. And I even had stock. And one day he announced that he had sold the company to Aramark, which is a food service company. And this was probably 71 or 72. And I said, I don't want to work for a food service company. And back then they had a theory that public companies should diversify. So a food service company bought a construction company, which of course turned out to be a disaster. And they bought the company back a few years later for half of what. But I got stock in Aramark. The stock went up every day. And back then, the Post used to publish an afternoon edition. Believe it or not, everybody bought the newspaper then. And I would sometimes take either a bus or the ferry back home to Staten Island. I would buy the Post and I would read the Aramark stock, and it would go up every day. Every day went up, every day. And I'm like in heaven. And then one day it drops like 10%. The next day it drops 20%. And I called a friend of mine in the stock market. I said, and this is before they had Bloomberg stuff. This is really, I said, can you find out why did this stock go down every day? And he called me back. He says, oh, it just came over the ticker. They're being investigated for antitrust. I said, all the insiders sold the stock, and I'm stuck with the stock. So basically, I didn't want to work for a food service company, and I decided I would give real estate a try.
So that's when your father came. You went to your father, or your father asked you to come?
My father took me to lunch once a year, and this time I said yes. And believe it or not, one of his partners, not my father, gave me 10% of Newmark for free. So I owned 10% for free, which came from my father's partner, not from my father.
And then what was the state of the portfolio when you came there? Did you have any ideas of like how you wanted to change the company or what you wanted to do?
Well, naturally I wanted to do construction, so that was part of the deal.
Was he not doing construction at the time? Or?
No, he managed mostly garment center. Newmark was a garment center company, but they had one big client that was really the first REIT, Furman Wolfson, which was a REIT, I think before REITs even knew what a REIT was. And that was his client, and he managed the buildings for them, along with some other garment buildings, and he owned some buildings. His uncle was a guy named Aaron Rabinowitz, and he was Fred F. French. He ran Fred F. French, and his two brothers were the Spear of Helmsley Spear, and they changed their name from Rabinowitz to Spear, but Aaron Rabinowitz kept the name Rabinowitz, and he married a very wealthy woman, and they were like really like elite. And if you go to 551 Madison is the Fred F. French building, and 515 Madison was a Fred F. French building, and he net leased it to my father to give him a start in the business. And Fred F. French also built Tudor City, so they're a big company. So and the Spears, you know. So my father started out when he graduated NYU. He was reading water meters and electric meters for Spear and Company.
And how did you convince your father to start doing development?
Well, part of the deal was that we would do some development, but on a small scale. So I was buying these old warehouses and converting them into co-ops. And I bought two warehouses from a woman, Liberty Warehouse, and converted it to 12 co-op apartments. The other one was 14. I bought one was on Hudson Street, 571 Hudson. The other was on Perry Street. Nobody lived there. Perry Street. I was a pioneer on Perry Street.
In the West Village, you're talking about?
In the West Village. Now I think Stephen Cohen lives in the West Village. But nobody lived there. I was a total pioneer. But I didn't make any money. It was so much work. You had to get a variance because all these buildings were in manufacturing zones. So you had to convince the Board of Standing and Appeals that there was no interest, nobody wanted to rent storage space, and that would take a year or two, whining and dining people on community boards, and you'd have to get their support, and then, so that's what I was doing, and I loved it. I didn't make any money, but it was a lot of fun.
And then at some point, in 1978, you brought in Barry Gosen to be your partner. You're always big on collaborations, on projects and on companies. How did you and Barry come together?
So simple.
By the way, Barry says that he's the Neil Diamond of the group, and that Jeff is the cool one. He's the Lou Reed of the group. So I thought that's a good comparison.
Barry's made me rich, to be honest. And where it came from, we were managing a building at 230 Fifth Avenue. And back then, in 78, there was what they call industry buildings. So that particular building, and they were showroom buildings. So there would be buildings in the garment center would be all ladies' garments, all men's garments, all children's this, all that. There was the toy center, and this was the lamp building. And basically they would have 2 or 3 shows a year, and all of the buyers who bought lamps would come to 230 Fifth Avenue, start at the top, and they would have a list of which showrooms they were going to go to, and they would go and these buildings were good because they weren't competing with the office buildings. They were only competing with the showroom buildings. And one day Rudin built a brand new showroom building, 41 Madison, which was the first brand new showroom building that anyone ever built. And Jack Schenker, who was the older partner that I was telling you about, who had came to my father and I one day, and he said, "These 2 young guys are stealing all our tenants and putting them in 41 Madison. Maybe we should meet with them." And it was Barry Gosen and a guy named Harvey Richer, and they had this little dippy-do company. Barry had worked for Edward S. Gordon, people who were old. Edward S. Gordon was really the preeminent leasing company because they were the first. Eddie Gordon was the first one to actually come up with a way to market office space.
And that eventually became CBRE, Ed S.
Yeah, it
Gordon.
became Insignia and then CBRE. But Eddie Gordon was the first one to come up with marketing. So his idea, you would get like a baseball, and a box autographed by somebody famous, and he would say, "We're having an open house to show off this building on the 31st floor. Come and meet, some famous pitcher, Dwight Gooden," it would probably be before. And you'd get this baseball and he had all of these gimmicks. And in the old days, we weren't dealing with new buildings, but basically you had Cushman & Wakefield, and Eddie Gordon and Cross and Brown, and only Eddie was marketing. The others would put a sign up, "Space for rent, Cushman & Wakefield, call so-and-so." And that was the marketing effort. And Eddie really invented it. And Barry worked for Eddie and trained with Eddie. And
How did you lure him to come partner with you?
it wasn't hard, to be honest with you. I think they saw an opportunity because they were like a 3-person company, and we were at least a decent size. And fortunately, Barry came with Harvey, and then eventually we bought the company from my father and his partners for $500,000, which was all that it was worth.
So that's what you bought Newmark for $500,000 from your father.
$50,000 up front and like $100,000 a year.
That was
for
after
5
4 years of working with him, or was it longer?
couple of years, yeah. And things had, I've been through recessions that are brutal. When people don't know how bad things can get. And this was back when, you'd see things like Ford, to New York City, drop dead. And my father was one of the founders of ABNY, the Association for Better New York, with Lou Rudin and a couple of other, civic-minded people to save the city. And I think they prepaid the real estate taxes in order to keep the city from defaulting on their debt. That's how bad things were. And I honestly, I had grown up in the 5 towns as a middle-class Jewish kid and had no desire to be particularly wealthy.
But
I thought middle class was good. Barry, on the other hand, grew up in Brooklyn, and his father was a gambler, and he had bookmakers would come to the door and knock, and Barry had to say, "I haven't seen my father for weeks," And Barry was driven, And he's one of the few people who really succeeded in his goal, which was to become a top broker. Never did we think, that Newmark would become so big, but his goal was to become one of the top brokers. And there were a handful of top brokers in the city back then.
But specifically, you said Barry made you rich. How did Barry make you rich?
Because he wanted to be rich. And we decided that we would try to buy buildings, and I would be the one to find the buildings to buy, and he would do the leasing. And I hired a guy named Dan Friedman, who was a bright guy. He might have been a Harvard guy. And I sent him around to look at deals. And I swear to you, back then, brokers would come to us with literally, people say back of the envelope. A guy would come, top brokers, the leading guys would come, this is a deal for you, because they knew we were B guys, B and C guys. And they would show income, expense, cash flow, price. That would be it. And my criteria was, if I thought a building could make a 10% return in 2 or 3 years, I would buy it. And that was it. So we bought, luckily for us, we couldn't afford to buy, really nice buildings. We bought all of these old manufacturing buildings. New York had 1.5 million manufacturing jobs back then. Now they have 50,000. So
This
back
was in
then,
the 70s.
Yeah,
This was in the 70s.
back then, New York was a manufacturing hub. Garment Center was all manufacturing. We owned.
The Garment Center was the largest employer in New York City at that time.
Yeah, I bought a building where this guy made hats, which you don't see anybody wear hats. They would all kinds of and luckily for us, all these buildings were in neighborhoods that everybody wants to be in today. So it's much easier for me to lease in Soho and Tribeca than it is on 53rd and Madison, where we've now, that was the building that my father got from his uncle. That's where our offices are. And for the first time ever, we're in a building we own. We always wanted to be a building we own, but it never worked out.
Well, your father was a very active guy, so when you came to take over his business, did he have other plans, or did he think that, was he just going to give you the business and sort of do other things? What was his...
No, he was there telling me that everything I was doing was wrong. So, and the reason he was saying that was my father grew up in the Depression. So he remembers how bad things were, and he didn't like to take risk. So my father looked at it, he owned 5 buildings, Newmark made a few bucks. Why should I take a chance and buy a building? And same, my attitude is a little bit like that,
And then, but at the same time, you guys decided to take Newmark. I'm going to have to skip over a couple of questions because we're running a little late. But at the same time, you decided to take, not at the same time, years later, you did take Newmark national at a time when it wasn't so easy to be national. You didn't have the networks, you didn't have the community, but you guys thought that Newmark could be bigger than just New York. What made you make that decision? Did Barry have something to do with that?
Yeah, Barry's idea. Newmark.
Can you put the mic to
Newmark we were really struggling because basically we owned all these buildings and another recession came and we were screwed. And then
this was in the early 90s, or?
This was 80s. I think 87. The government passed a law that eliminated these tax refuges. People would buy real estate only for the tax benefits, irregardless of whether the building made any money. And the buildings would be syndicated to accountants, doctors who were just looking for losses. And one day, Bill Bradley, the genius, comes up and says, we got to eliminate these tax shelters. And he was right. He made one mistake. He didn't say, starting today, we're going to eliminate them. He said, they're eliminated. So all of the deals that people had invested in for tax benefits, they no longer are eligible for the benefits. They walked away, and they gave the buildings back to the banks. The banks all failed. The federal government took over the banks and set up this resolution trust company, lost the taxpayers God knows how much money. And we were struggling, so Barry decided we would go into the leasing business because we weren't in the leasing business. We were really in the ownership, in the management and ownership business, and now we were going to do third-party leasing. And we sublet some space on Madison Avenue, And Barry hired a bunch of brokers from Helmsley Spear and from Insignia, mainly the old guys who were on the way out anyway. Eddie Gordon was probably going to fire them anyway, and Helmsley Spear was on the way down. And we set up a brokerage business, and then that grew, and then I got friendly with the people from GE Credit, and they made us a deal that they had foreclosed on 125 Park, and they made us a deal that if we would move in and take 2 floors at $20 a foot, they would give us the management of the building, which was a big deal, and across from Grand Central. So if you can imagine, there's a building across the street from Grand Central that probably had a $30 million mortgage that was in foreclosure. That's how bad things were.
But you didn't want to be in leasing. You wanted to be in ownership.
I had no interest in leasing. I went with Barry one time on a pitch, and we got thrown out by a security guard because Barry said something, I'm here to see the CFO, and they pretended that he knew him. And once the guy knew that we didn't know him, he called security. We got thrown out. I said, I'm never doing this again. I can't take rejection, because that's what brokerage is, a lot of rejection, cold calling, that's what it is.
Is that why you brought in Jimmy Kuhn to run that business?
Barry brought in Jimmy Kuhn. He was working for Bernie Mendick, and Bernie sold his business to Vornado. And Jimmy didn't want to work for Vornado because Vornado was a public company. Bernie was like me. And Jimmy was looking for a place, and we brought in Jimmy. He had a lot of institutional clients, contacts, etc. So Barry, Jimmy, and I own the company. And then Barry started hiring top brokers. And in order to do that, he had to offer them equity in Newmark. So he hired some top guys, a lot of guys from Williams for some reason.
Not in the buildings, in the brokerage business.
In the brokerage, right. Forget the buildings. We weren't buying anything because we, we were lucky to escape with our skin, and I never ever gave the keys back to any buildings, and it was tough. I mean, literally, there was a period of time where no bank would finance any real estate, and the banks that had the loans wanted to be paid back, and we'd say, well, who's lending me the money to pay you back? And the guy who made a lot of money then was Steve Witkoff. Steve Witkoff was a lawyer at Dreyer and Traub, and he was smart enough to buy these buildings from the banks, because it was hard for me to buy a building, even though I knew it was a super steal. If I was going to a bank and say, I have no money, I can't pay back the loan, they didn't want to see that I bought a building across the street for X, and that I showed up in a limousine or some stupid thing. So I would, take the subway, and so Witkoff was smart because he didn't owe any money to any bank, so he started buying the buildings from the banks. The banks were selling buildings for nothing. And the buildings we bought, it's hard to believe how little we paid for the buildings, for the vast majority of the buildings we own. And then in answer to your question, so then we became a big brokerage company, and that became successful, but we were competing with CB, JLL, Cushman & Wakefield, who were all public companies. And the problem we had was that after another recession, maybe after 2000, I don't know.
Early 2000s, that's what early 2000s was the dot-com crash.
Disastrous, right, the dot-com crash. Thank you. I didn't rent to a single dot-com company. Because after you've been around a while, you know what's going to happen. But the problem we had was that a lot of the big corporations, to save money, got rid of their real estate department. So they had no real estate department. So they were interviewing brokers to essentially be not only their brokers, but also their real estate department. So what happened to us is they said to us, do you have offices all over the world? Of course, we had no offices all over the world. So Barry made a cockamamie deal with Knight Frank, because it used to be Newmark Knight Frank. And Knight Frank was an English company that held offices all over the world. So we created so we had to deal with them, even though they didn't own us, we didn't own them. any companies they had in their, where they had offices that wanted space in New York, they would give us. And we would refer the same thing. So if you wanted space in South Africa or someplace.
So it was sort of a no stock deal between you guys and Knight Frank.
Right.
And did that change your mindset about like how the partnerships and the collaborations could grow the business?
Yes and no. The problem then hit, people wanted us to have an office in the U.S. Do you have an office in Chicago? Do you have an office in Texas? Do you have an office in Boston? We didn't have any offices there. So every year we would open another office, and in order to open an office, you had to buy all the furniture, all the equipment, hire brokers. Sometimes you had to pay them bonuses, put up a security deposit. So it was costing us $1 million to open an office. Our profit was like $1 million. So basically, we were making nothing. If our profit was $2 million, $1 million went to taxes and $1 million went to open offices. So we were spinning our wheels, even though we were successful. The brokerage wasn't really doing well. The ownership was doing well, but not the brokerage.
And your father saw all of this happen too. What was his take on it, and what kind of advice did he dispense?
I guess my father was shocked. My father and I never agreed on anything. And the reason, and the way we would get along, we finally came to a plan to get along. We divided all the buildings up. He took half and I took half. And we never had another fight again. Back then, a lot of
What year was that? Around what time?
See, this probably in the mid-'80s.
In the mid-'80s?
Yeah.
You guys split the portfolio.
Yeah, and believe it or not, he did a lot of business on the golf course. He would come in sometimes and say, "Oh, I met so-and-so, he needs space, give him a call, here's his card." There was never a first round and all of that. I don't own a single building where I had to go through that system of bidding against other people. Every single building that I own, I was competing against no one, as far as I know. Basically, the broker would say, "This is the deal, this is the price." I would look to see if I could make a 10% return, and if I could, I'd buy it. So you'd get a building that cost $10 million. You borrow $7 million from a bank, and you'd call two people and say, "Well, I bought this building, I need a partner, $1 million each, three people," and that's how we would buy buildings. And then we would then go and convert the buildings to offices, and these buildings are worth 200 million. I mean, it's hard to believe, and then but it became. We really stopped buying because it became very hard for me to buy a building that was across the street from a building I bought for 10 million that was now for sale for 100 million. And those buildings are also worth 200 million, probably. They might have been worth 300, but it just became impossible. I couldn't get it through my head that we could buy it and paid 10 times what I paid. And a lot of it, we bought buildings from banks. My father had a good relationship with banks. We had, I forget the name of the bank, and the banker came to see my father and I, and he had two buildings, 528th Avenue and the Helmsley building, the one at the, and they were owned, I think, by Ostreicher, who I knew, and Ostreicher liked me, and they were foreclosing on him, and he came to us and said, "We'll sell you 528th Avenue for $6 million, which was the mortgage. So we'll just take over the mortgage and pay us, and we'll make the interest rate 5%. And I said, "What about the Helmsley? What about that one?" And he said, "Now you're Garment Center guys. You're not Park Avenue guys." And I forget who bought that.
What was the thing that made you? I mean, you have 80 buildings all this time. You're accumulating and accumulating, but you really narrowed in on those small, mid-sized buildings.
Yeah.
What was it? What was so attractive about those and not? I mean, you have big buildings now, but obviously over the years you focused on those mid-sized buildings. What was more attractive about them other than the price?
It's all we could afford. I mean, and like I own a building. We partnered up with the Bronfman family. And we bought 3 buildings with them, and would have made a fortune if they didn't force us to sell 2 of them. But I kept the building, 40 Worth, which is in the heart of Tribeca, And I think we bought it for like $35 million. And we could probably, if I converted some of the apartments, I could probably sell a couple apartments and get $35 million. It's great.
But you said generally you don't like to do condos because you don't know what to do with all the cash. So
I never liked to do condos because you were selling. I never wanted to sell anything. I hated selling. And Barry, who was a broker, would say to me, "Why aren't you reselling?" We would get offers for a building we'd been 10, and we would struggle in. And we would get an offer for a $10 million building, $50 million, and we were struggling to pay the rent, to pay the debt. And I said to him, because I'm an analytical thinker, because it's an engineering thing, I said, "Well, Barry, I look around, and who are the richest people, real estate people in New York? The people who never sell. They're the richest people. It's not the guys who buy and sell and flip. It's the Dursts, it's the Rudins, and that was it. I was just saying, I'm not that smart. I'm just looking around the neighborhood, and the richest guys are the ones who never sell. So I'm not selling. And I've sold buildings where I had to, and because partners made me sell. But I don't like, other than that, I've never sold anything.
Speaking of partnerships, you tend to do that a lot. You tend to collaborate with people on businesses, on deals, on buildings. And even, the Flatiron Building, you slowly bought into that and eventually owned the whole thing. What made, a lot of people don't like to do partnerships because they know it can get hairy. Somehow you managed to do all these collaborations and partnerships, and they've benefited you.
Most of the partnerships are with a handful of people that we've known. My father always would say, and he's right, by the way, he said, "You'll find out who your good partners are when you do a capital call." And that's when you find out who the good partners are, because, people hate capital calls. It doesn't matter if you distributed $50 million and you're doing a $2 million capital call and you're reminding the guy, "So you got $50 million. They don't care. The Flatiron Building was, sadly, we were running real estate for three women who had inherited 52% of the Flatiron Building. And Leona Helmsy owned 17.5%, 18%. And this guy, Nathan Silverstein, inherited 25% from his father, and he was crazy. And Leona was a horrible human being. And what she did was she tried to force her partners out. So she never distributed any money. So these three women would get a K-1 from their accountant saying, "Congratulations, you made $1 million at the Flatiron Building. You owe the government, $300,000, and they never got a distribution. She was trying to force them out, and finally they just couldn't take it anymore. The market was terrible, and they sold us. I think we paid for their 50%, like $4.2 million plus
For the Flatiron Building.
for the 50% of the Flatiron Building, subject to a mortgage of $4.2 million. And, and everything was great.
This was in 1998, or?
This was when things were terrible. I can't remember, because I've been through so many terrible experiences, I can't keep track of them all. But believe me, things were terrible. And, and luckily, we offered it to all of the brokers in the company, and we lawyers. So we had people who had, like a 0.5%. And then we had this crazy, and I was able to, I leased the building to Holtspring, which was Macmillan, and they had been in the building forever. And nobody could understand why would somebody want to be on 20 floors. And the reason was that they loved the building, they loved the cachet, and they had all these editors who had like an office with a window in the Flatiron Building.
The history of the building is that it was mostly vacant. People didn't like to be in the area, and the building was very tough to design within. But because of the architectural beauty of it, the whole neighborhood changed.
I outsmarted this guy, Nathan. I made a deal with him whereby the three of the partners, myself, we had partnered up with Sorgenti, an Italian group who had bought part of our interest. They had owned the Chrysler Building, and they were forced to sell it because they were partners, I think, with Tishman Speyer, and they had a fund that only bought, landmark buildings and all of this. So we sold them. Some of my partners sold them sold them because they were offering a pretty high price. And so the three of us net leased net leased the building from the four of us. So basically, I made a deal with Nathan where he was part of the fee ownership, but not the lease, and we net leased it, and we made I made a deal with Hold Spring to lease the whole building for 15 years, and they paid the rent, and the rent went up every 5 years, so we were paying $4 million. I was distributing $4 million the first year, $5 million, the first $5 million, $6 million, everything was great. But a year before the lease was up, the Hold Spring people said, we can't be here anymore. It makes no sense for us to be on 20 floors. And the building, as beautiful as the building on the outside, it was horrible on the inside. Hold Spring had spent little or nothing to upgrade their office space, and it was 2x4 grist ceilings, vinyl asbestos tile.
And now it's being converted into condos.
Which I didn't want to do because I'm selling it, but Nathan made life so difficult. So I said, Nathan, what are we going to do? We're going to have an empty building. So he said, well, see if you can find a tenant who'll take the space as is with no free rent and no broker. So naturally, who do you think would do that? WeWork and Notel. So I made a deal with Notel because Newmark had invested in Notel. I don't know why. And it was a great deal. They'd put up $55 million letter of credit. So even though they went bankrupt, we would have cashed that in. So I bring the deal to Nathan, and he said, well, they're a terrible tenant. I said, yeah, I know they're a terrible tenant, but who do you think is going to rent? You know, you think Apple is going to take the space as is with no free rent and no And I mean, you had to gut the whole thing, take out the asbestos. It was awful. So then he thought I was a crook, you know. The one thing, you can say anything to me you want. Don't ever say I'm dishonest. That gets me crazy because I'm not a crook. And we were stuck with this guy, and his father told him never to borrow money. So it took us 6 months to get him to borrow $30 million, which we used to pay off the 4 and to do the demo and the asbestos removal. And then we hired Cushman & Wakefield because he didn't want to hire Newmark because he thought I was a crook. And I said, go ahead, who do you want? So I think we hired maybe CB. And they tried to find, you know, office tenants. And in the meantime, the shit hit the fan with COVID. And when we recovered, there was no hope of finding, no bank would finance an office conversion. So we had no choice but to do it.
Can you imagine, now you released the first phase, one building in the Flatiron Building is going to go for $50 million. The full sellout is expected to be over $700 million, if I'm not mistaken.
I hope so.
Can you imagine that after for $4.5 million, you got into this deal that's going to yield so much?
Yeah, and luckily I gave my grandson has a tiny piece. I gave my kids a little piece, so they'll get. But no, you could never imagine. And I went through the building Tuesday because they're. You know, I check in on it every couple of months, and finally, they got the okay from the AG to start selling, and they sold an apartment in like the first day.
Yes.
And they have, I think, 2 other offers, but it's going to be spectacular. I mean, the apartments are gorgeous, and they have a beautiful lobby, and they put a swimming pool in the basement and a health club and all of this. It's going to be a beautiful, and like I said to everybody, you know, I don't care what the market is because we're in a supply and demand business. There's only 40 apartments in a building, and there's only 3 buildings in New York that people would consider iconic: Chrysler, Empire State, and Flatiron. Yeah. So there's got to be 40 people in the world that are going to want to say to somebody, "Hey, I bought my father bought an apartment for me in the Flatiron Building." So.
That sounds like good marketing. I like that.
Yeah, you know.
So I got to jump ahead here. But so then you decided to get into gambling. And tell me how you got into that. But you got to explain this whole thing of how every bet touches you somehow. But go ahead, tell us how you got into the Meadowland racetracks.
So I believe it or not, when I was young, horse racing was more popular than football and baseball. everybody went to the racetrack, and I lived near Roosevelt Raceway, which was a harness.
Can you hold it?
I lived in Roosevelt Raceway, which was a harness track, and everybody went to the track, packed. I would go with my friends on the weekends. If I couldn't get a date, I couldn't say I don't have a date. I would say I'm going to the track, and it was usually popular, and I fell in love with it. And over time, I bought some horses, and then horse racing died because they didn't know how to market it. It's too slow. Who knows? And obviously, Atlantic City opened. Lotteries came into playing. So whereas if you wanted to make a legal bet, you had to go to a racetrack. Now you could buy a lottery ticket, or you could go to Atlantic City or Connecticut. So I realized that horse racing is a dying business. The only thing that could save it is if the government allows you to install slot machines and share the revenue with the horsemen and the owner of the facility. So I was politically connected because I'm a big Democrat, for better or for worse, and the people who own the racetracks came to me and they said, "Can you get us a meeting with Shelley Silver, who was the assembly speaker back then?" Because the governor, Pataki, was on board, and Joe Bruno was the Senate president. He was on board. We needed Shelley Silver. And I was able to get a meeting with Shelley Silver, and I thought Shelley was going to give me an argument about the morality of gambling. And instead he said, "Why would I bother? It's only going to make $100 million. And I said, "It's going to make $1 billion for the state." He said, "If you can show me it's going to make $1 billion, I'll go along." And I hired a consultant company, and they did their homework, and we came back, and believe it or not, it actually made $1 billion. Usually the projections are way off. So then my wife said to me, "Why are you doing all of this? You don't own a racetrack." Good point. So I started to try to find a racetrack to buy, and I thought I bought one in Kentucky, fell through. I thought I bought one at Saratoga, which would have been a gold mine, that fell through. And finally, a guy called me and said, there's a old quarter horse track that's been foreclosed in Nichols, New York, which I said, "Where's that?" "Between Binghamton and Elmira." And my mother was from Binghamton, and I used to hate to go to Binghamton as a kid because it was a 4-hour drive on a 2-lane road. You get behind the truck. Now they have the quick way, but it was terrible. And what am I going to do? And I had young sisters who had annoyed, so. So I took a ride up there. I said, "Let's go look at and see what's what." My mother would get a kick out of it. She unfortunately died young. And we go check into like a Best Western. And I said to these two young women behind the counter, I said, "Gee, I'm thinking of buying this foreclosed racetrack," which had been closed for, say, 20 years. It was right off the highway, so everybody knew what I was talking about. And they said, "Oh, great idea. There's nothing to do around here. You'll do fine." I go look at the place. It's falling apart. I have no idea. So now I'm checking out on 2 new women, and I said, "Gee, I'm thinking of buying Tioga Downs. What do you think?" "Great idea. There's nothing to do around here. You'll do fine." So I made a deal to buy it, but I didn't know anything. I'd been in the casino three times in my life. I had no interest. I was a horse guy. And I partnered with a casino company, Nevada Gold, and a hedge fund, and a Canadian company. And the casino company assures me we're going to make money. They had books of analysis. Okay, fine. We open the doors, we're losing $1 million a month. So, and I was...
What year was this?
This was 2006. After a year, they're supposed to turn it around, and nothing's going right. And they come to me and they say, "Our stock is 2 cents. We got to get out of this. Would you buy us out?" So we bought them out at a big discount with the hedge fund. The other guy just disappeared. So now I owned half, and the hedge fund owned half, and the only way we were going to survive was for me to convince the government to lower the tax rate. And I would go to Albany and argue to lower the tax rate. And I would tell them, if you lower the tax rate, you're going to make more money. The income of the state will go up. And every time they thought I was crazy, but they would do it. And every time the income of the state went up. So I had a good track record. So I got the tax rate lowered 4 or 5 times. And now it was starting to be profitable. And then luck is important in life. The hedge fund, I guess, maybe, when did hedge funds go under? When was that? I remember
2008.
Yeah. So he calls me. He says, Jeff, unfortunately, I'm going out of business. My fund, too many withdrawals. I have to close. But I made a deal with Blackstone. It was later than that. It was probably 12. Yeah. I made a deal with Blackstone to take over the debt and restructure the debt. But the good news for you is they don't want to have to get licensed, so they're giving you my 50% equity. So I now own 100%. I have some family in it, but I basically own 100%. And now it's still marginal. And then the state decided that they would try to finally legalize casinos in New York. And Andrew was the governor, and we were on good terms. And he called me, he said, this is the plan. I'm going to just do a constitutional amendment, and I'm just going to change 4 words in the Constitution. Where it says casinos are illegal, it says 7 casino licenses will be issued. And then they realized that no one wanted a casino upstate. They all wanted a casino downstate. Makes sense. So Andrew came up with a scheme where the upstate licenses there would be 4 upstate licenses, and the downstate licenses couldn't be issued for 7 years. And I ended up, helping get it passed. He called me. He says, "You got to help. We got to pass the referendum. Your share of the campaign is $700,000." Okay, blah blah blah. The thing passes easily. He comes up to the southern tier, to Binghamton University, and jobs for the southern tier. Okay, everything's great. And then they put out how they're going to do the licenses, and they divide the state into 9 regions. 3 regions have Indian tribes, so those regions can't apply for a license because it's illegal to tax an Indian tribe. They're sovereign nations. So the way the state gets around it is they go to the tribe and they say, we want you to pay us 25% of your slot revenue, and in exchange, we will agree never to put a casino within 50 miles. And that's the way to legally get a tribe to pay. So 3 of the regions are tribes, 3 of the regions are downstate, and 3 of them are considered upstate, and I'm in the southern tier region. And I look at the map, and the map is like a gerrymandered thing. There's like the southern tier, and there's a sliver 5 miles wide that goes up to Lake Champlain. And I said, uh-oh, somebody's screwing me. And because it made no sense. Why would this sliver? And there was another racino. I was what they call a racino. A racetrack with slot machines is a racino. And the way it was legal is the lottery owned the machines and ran them. So the argument to the courts was it's no different than a scratch-off ticket. You go to a newsstand, you buy a thing, pushes a button, a ticket comes out. So essentially, you could say it is the same. So everything was run by the lottery, and this was a racino. So there was a racino 20 miles from this. So sure enough, a company called Lago tries to get a casino license in the southern tier up by Lake Champlain, and they're 20 miles from Finger Lakes, which is a racino. I called my friends at Finger Lakes. I said, I hope you're going to complain about this or put you out of business. He says, of course we did. We went to see the governor and the governor's office, and they said, don't worry about it. Don't oppose the project. Jeff is getting the license. You don't have to do anything. Fast forward, I didn't get the license. I called Andrew every name I could think of. And he had no choice but to reopen the Southern Tier licenses, because there was a state senator, Tom Libbis, was his buddy. He was a Republican, and he went to see Cuomo and said, how could you do this to Jeff? And he said, okay, I'll reopen the bids, but this time let's hope we get a better bidder than Jeff. And luckily for me, they didn't. Nobody bid on it. And I got the license. I was the only bidder. So now I own a successful casino up in the middle of nowhere, and I work very hard. I respond to every single comment card that I respond. Everybody knows me. I wear orange Crocs when I'm up there, and people love that the owner is a nice guy.
Jeff, so you have 2 horse tracks and you have 2 racinos. I mean, you have 2 racinos and 2 casinos.
Now I own the Meadowlands racetrack, which was a harness track that was owned by the state that was about to close, and I make a deal with the state, and we agree that we're going to try to get the law that doesn't allow sports betting outside of Nevada changed. And we partner with New Jersey. New Jersey passes an amendment that allows sports betting. The league is opposed to it, of course, because they're so stupid that they spend millions and zillions of dollars opposing it. And we lose. And we lose at the lower court, we lose at the Court of Appeals, we appeal to the Supreme Court, and they don't take the case. Then we have this genius constitutional lawyer who says, here's what we're going to do. We're going to get another referendum passed that's going to say that you can have sports betting in New Jersey as long as it's not regulated or taxed by the state. I said, so you mean that I'm going to regulate sports betting at the Meadowlands? Yeah, that's the only way we're going to get it passed. Okay, we lose in the lower court, we lose at the appellate, and I'm paying these legal fees. So I finally say to them, don't tell me you're going to appeal to the Supreme Court. It's costing a fortune. And they say, it's a Hail Mary, but we have no choice, that's it. Lo and behold, we appeal to the Supreme Court, and they take the case. Once they take the case, you're probably going to win, because you win. When you appeal to the Supreme Court, they only take 0.3% of all the cases that are appealed to them. Yeah. And this is a pretty simple case. Why is sports betting allowed in Las Vegas, not in New Jersey? And so everybody was shocked. We became the favorite to win, and they have oral arguments, and sure enough, everybody's calling me, Jeff, you're going to win. And it became legal, and I controlled sports betting because I was the only one that I had a racetrack in New Jersey and a casino in New York. So I was the only one that could give a company both New York and New Jersey. So everybody was, so I convinced, I didn't make a lot of money out of this, but they did. I convinced, there was this company, Paddy Power, in England, and they knew what they were doing as far as sports betting. FanDuel had no idea what they were doing, but they had all the customers from their fantasy bullshit. So I said, why don't the two of you merge, and I'll give you New York and New Jersey, and that's what happened. They did. And FanDuel in New Jersey, we dominated until competition came along. But it's a great business. We win almost every day.
Did you make more money from those licenses than you did from the actual racetracks?
100%. Wow. We'd be out of business. We'd be out of business without.
Well, it sounds like you took a lot of risks when you didn't know what the outcome was going to be.
Yes, but I'm a horse guy. It was really because I love horse racing, not because I was intelligent.
I know we're at the end of our time. Just one last thing. Jeff, your grandson's in the audience. Pretend like none of these people are here. Give him some advice.
I told him what to do. He said to me, he only worked for me for a few months.
How's he doing? How's he doing?
He's doing great. So he said, aren't people going to resent that I come here? I'm your grandson, I said, I had the same problem. It's very simple. Just make sure you're the first person in the office in the morning and the last person to leave, and no one will resent that you're here. And the poor kid has to stay. So everybody leaves, and I leave. I leave pretty late, and he's still there. I feel bad. But that was what you got to do. You got to prove to people that you're a hard worker, and if you can show that you're a hard worker, everybody will accept you. And he's good. My granddaughter, I forgot to invite her to come here. She's very good. She runs the Soho buildings for us, and she's doing a great job. It's really a thrill to have your grandchildren working here. You have to have children young in order for that to happen. And luckily, my wife and I did have children young because of the fact that I got a job in California when it looked like I was jobless and couldn't get married.
Well, Jeff, thank you so much for tonight. This was wonderful. It's an honor having you here tonight, sharing your stories. Thank you guys for all being here. We're still here for another hour. So
I hope I made it interesting because I really didn't talk about real estate much.
No, you did. You did. It was
I
great.
Talked about other things that are more interesting than real estate.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, guys. Thanks, everyone.